So let's get into some tasting. So as I said, I talked a bit about micro distillers, craft distillers, small distillers, however you want to call them, but some of the smaller producers in the last video. And I want to taste some of my favorite examples. I couldn't resist just tasting one North of Seven, so I picked two. And I have a Two Brewers and a Shelter Point. Starting with the North of Seven, these are both made sort of in an American style mix of grains, matured in new oak. And these are special whiskeys to me because they're both cask selections that I made. So one of them, cask 16, was we tasted 10 different casks. There was a bunch of us together, and we picked our favorite one, which happened to be a 4-grain whiskey that was about 6 years old. So it was corn, rye, wheat, and malted barley, matured in new oak, bottle at cask strength 74.5%. Wild. This year we only took 6. 10 was a bit ambitious 2 years ago, and selected a whiskey that was a different type. It was a whiskey made sort of in the style of a high rye bourbon, so matured in a new oak cask, mostly corn, a fair chunk of rye in there, and some malted barley. So really like a high rye bourbon type recipe, but it doesn't taste like a bourbon. Neither does the 4-grain. So made a bit differently. Then 2 single malts. One is a classic single malt from Two Brewers, which is a single malt that's made, matured in ex-bourbon casks, and aged and distilled up in Yukon. So pretty neat. And then Shelter Point, the Collective, which is a pretty neat whiskey. It's called the Collective because a bunch of people who worked at the distillery each selected a cask that they really liked, and they blended those casks all together to form a whiskey. And I'm going to read it off my phone just to get it right. Pretty interesting. So one of the casks was a wheat whiskey in an ex-bourbon cask. You had a single malt in an ex-bourbon cask. You had a single malt in an ex-bourbon cask that was then finished for 2 years in virgin oak casks. You had a single malt that was ex-bourbon, but then it was finished in ex-Lefroy casks for 18 months. So Lefroy, peaty, smoky Scotch. So you get, a lot of peaty, smoky flavors. And finally you had an unmalted barley whiskey that was matured in ex-bourbon and then finished in ex-Lefroy casks for 18 months. So quite the mix. You have everything from wheat to unmalted barley to malted barley and a whole assortment of casks. So pretty interesting. Turns out to be actually my favorite whiskey that Shelter Point's released to date. And all of these whiskeys, I would say, are in the top tier of Canadian whiskeys, even competing with all the big guys. So pretty neat. So a bit of a stingy pour. I'll pour a bit more. Maybe we'll start with Two Brewers. This whiskey was released 10, and it was their first cask strength release. It was 58%. It's one of my favorite Two Brewers to date, although I've liked every one of them that I've tried. So if we nose it, it's brilliant. If you ever have a chance to nose Two Brewers, it's such a bright single malt. There's all this tropical fruit that comes out. There's all sorts of layering in terms of vanilla and oak. You get all these kind of fresh orchard fruit notes as well. The tropical fruit, as I said, you get a nice undercurrent of spice as well. And if you taste it, it turns into a wow. Awesome. It starts out sweet, kind of focused on the fruit. You still get a bunch of oak. You get a nice amount of sort of dried fruit coming in, like dried apricot. And it kind of keeps progressing along this sweet fruity trail, and then it seems to get upended by this really sharp herbal grain notes, like really spicy, kind of like arugula. It's kind of a spicy herbal note. And then all of a sudden you have this really sharp kind of edgy grain that's present, and it's all balanced, it's all interesting, it's all delicious. And then the finish is this soft, sweet, fruity finish that just kind of slowly leads you on. It's brilliant. It's just an absolutely brilliant whiskey. Yeah, I mean, tasting it again, pear, spice, like I could just keep going on with this whiskey. But you probably tell by my animation that it's one that is really good and really worth trying. So all the two brewers are worth trying. I find their classic line to be, really dependable. Their finishes line's also quite good. Their innovative line's really interesting. They make some really good, some of their innovative whiskeys have been some of my favorites. So they are all good. They make a peated line as well. It seemed to take a while to get going, and now the peated whiskeys, the last couple of batches I've had, have just been jaw droppers. So again, really interesting because smoky, but the brightness of the fruit is retained, like the kind of tropical notes, and it's balanced, which is the brilliant thing. So anyway, so two brewers peated. But that being said, batch 10, awesome. So if we move on to Shelter Point, and this should be evidence to you that you should be trying whiskey from small producers if you're into whiskey. Yeah, so the Collective. So this is very, very different. It's very nutty, kind of like on almonds. You get lots of spice notes, and grainy, but it's very different. This was kind of bright, refined, elegant. This is more like assertive, central. Like the grain in this one is more assertive and central. Yeah, and you get a wide range. You get caramel. You get I forgot what it's saying. Yeah, spice. You get like almost some like corn oil, which is interesting. There's no corn in here, but I think there's something in there that's just grainy, kind of thick. Lots of pear, vanilla. Yeah, and really rich. It has a spiciness that's a bit reminiscent of Irish pot still as well. Maybe partly due to the unmalted barley in there. And if you taste it, it's just such a ride. You get sweet grain kind of at the beginning. You still get a bunch of fruit. A lot of it's pear. The peat, like the smokiness, really comes out. Not just the smokiness, but also the earthiness, really comes out on the palate. And you almost don't notice it, and then all of a sudden it's just everywhere. So it's not, again, this is just finished in casks that held peated whiskey, so it's not the level of peat as some of the really heavily peated whiskeys, but definitely present. The finish kind of has stewed apples. There's a tiny bit of nuttiness, like hazelnut, and spice, and then a bit of oak too, like a bit of sweet oak. Yeah, it's a really nice whiskey. It's really, really interesting. It's very complex. It's one you can spend a lot of time with. It's delicious. It's really enjoyable. It presents some savory notes that you don't usually find in whiskeys, especially a lot of the single malts are mostly malted barley whiskeys that we see. The finish is pleasant. A really, really nice whiskey. And it's 46%. I was just checking that. And it's natural color too. So you can kind of tell, like there's some new oak in there, but you can kind of tell the, a bit of the cask character, as much as, a lot of the whiskeys from the bigger distillers have caramel added to them. A lot of the ones from the smaller distilleries don't. Speaking of that, you can look how dark that is. That's all new oak. So let's jump over to the North of Sevens. We'll start with cask 16. So this was, it's 4 grain, 74.5%. So I will be adding water to this, but I can still smell it. It's such an interesting whiskey. It's so complex. You have tons and tons of this kind of nutty, spicy character. You have just layers and layers of grain. Like in this case, I said earlier, Two Brewers wasn't like oatmeal. This has more the thick, grainy character that would remind you of kind of a whole grain, like a mixed whole grain sort of oatmeal type thing. Really spicy. You get vanilla. Tons and tons of dried fruit. There's so much going on here if we taste it. It is hot. It you kind of, if you've ever had alcohol kind of at this percentage, especially ones that have a lot of flavor, it kind of just keeps getting hotter and hotter. So we'll be adding some water. That being said, the really interesting on the palate, very, very nutty, very, very grainy, lots and lots of oak, extremely, extremely flavorful. So if you compare this, like a lot of bourbons, even really nice ones, can be a bit one-dimensional. So they're kind of focused on, corn and oak. This one, like, there's just such a rich grain character to it, and you still have all the oak and all the spice that you could hope for. And just adding water just opens it all up, brightens it all up. All of a sudden you have the amount of oak and the way it's integrated into the whiskey is just phenomenal. The nuttiness, the spice, the dried fruit, the orchard fruit, it all just kind of blooms with a bit of water. Yeah, and on the palate you can just taste so much of the grain. I taste corn, wheat, rye, and barley. Like, I can taste all of them, and they're all in pretty strong force. It's really flavorful in a way that, as much as I would probably say the Two Brewers is, maybe a better whiskey, it'd be hard to go back to it now, just because you get so much flavor in this. This would now, be a lot lighter, and it would be too light now that my appetite has been set for so much flavor in this Cask 16. Yeah, just phenomenal. So we'll do one more North of 7. This is Cask 28 at 58.5%. So it's made sort of like a high rye bourbon. Very, very different on the nose. You get pineapple, you get a bit of dried cherry, crushed cherry as well, dried apricot, lots of oak, some like light corn husk kind of character, and then a pretty big kick of spices. It actually reminds me quite a bit of the high rye Four Roses whiskey. So as much as I said it's not quite like a bourbon, it's approaching being reminiscent of something like a Four Roses high rye. So very, very pleasant. Yeah, it's just really, really nice on the palate. It's a big kick of flavor. Just a brilliant portrayal of kind of rich corn, oak, spice. There's still some fruitiness in there. The finish is oaky, spicy, and corn. And then you get, on the rye side, like, there is a really nice sort of spicy character to it that's really pervasive throughout. It doesn't dominate, but it's kind of, in every bit of it. So, brilliant. So, anyway, 4 craft whiskeys. Try craft whiskeys in your area. If you can find anything from Shelter Point, Two Brewers, or North of 7, give them a go. There's some other distillers I recommended in the previous video as well. But try what you can have, especially locally and as you're traveling, and go taste it. If you like it, buy some. It's nice when you visit these places. You don't need to buy before you try. So it's a lot of fun. So thanks for tuning in. You've endured 4 whiskeys with me. So well done by you.